Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 104th video in our Master Series and the first video in our mixing phase. You're going to have to bear with me on this because this is a very important phase and there's some key issues that we have to deal with. First of all, when we get to the mixing phase, that the more complicated the mix is, the more complicated things become. And basically, you just need to slow down and really, as you add more things into the mix, that it becomes much more pertinent what each individual group or individual track's role is and the amount of work that you have to do to it or can do to it, to make a good mix. And it's something really to keep in mind, because on a real simple production, you can do a whole lot of cool stuff in mixing and refine things and do all kinds of wild stuff. The more complicated a mix gets, sometimes you really got to back off because you got to keep things a lot simpler, because things get lost in the mix and it just starts causing mud. And cleaning things up as you go along, like we had talked about before. That if you remember that at the very beginning of this Master Series, I tried to explain how important the recording phase is, getting a really good capture in time and things like that. And it was hugely important to your whole production. I mean, hugely. And every other thing else that we went through so far, editing, first phase processing, subgroup mixing and subgroup processing, that all those phases that we did, basically, that are great if those individual tracks or subgroups are going to be released unto themselves, like they're stems or subgroups that you're going to send to somebody and the mix is done, which they should have been processed like they're a mix unto themselves, to where they could be released all by themselves, radio ready. Now the problem is that when you get into mixing them into the mix, that sometimes that doesn't work that well. So there's all these steps that in the mixing phase, and we touched on that a little bit when we talked about subgroup mixing and subgroup processing, that basically as you start bringing things into the mix, that you may have to reevaluate everything that you've done so far. Sometimes even the recording. Sometimes you might get into the mix and all of a sudden realize, I really wish I'd used this other microphone, or captured this a little bit differently, for the mix now, because of the way it sounds. And you might go all the way back to recapturing things so you can capture them a little bit differently, depending on how your mind is set and how good of an audio, it's borderline whether or not it's because you're a better audio engineer or not. But sometimes the more understanding you have of recording and capturing can make you go back and re-record something and just go, no, I should have done that like that. Then it would have had the effect that I wanted. A less experienced engineer recording might not catch it and think it was in the processing or the editing or something like that. But a lot of times it can get fixed in some of those other phases. And the better you are, the better chance that it can get repaired or processed to where it comes out sounding the way you want it. The issue is that when you get into mixing, that you may be going back to each one of those individual phases. You may go back and recapture something. You may go back and re-edit a track a little bit. You may go back and reprocess a track a little bit, or you might go back and mix a group a little bit, to subgroup a little bit, or, process that subgroup a little bit differently to make it sit well in the mix. Which sounds funny, but sometimes, you get them processed and those subgroups and those individual tracks are perfect. You could send them to Sony. They are just beautiful. But when you start bringing them in the mix, that they don't sound as good with the whole mix, because their job is to complement the rest of the mix. Not everybody is the out front singer in a mix, and that's just a fact. So, the out front track, basically, it will be affected somewhat in that, because sometimes the out front track, it'll be like, well, now with everything up underneath it, the way it's processed and done sounds great, but now my out front track sounds tinny, or it sounds, bassy, or it sounds like it didn't have enough harmonic content, or it was recorded with the wrong microphone, or I didn't edit it well, I didn't do my flow editing on it good enough for now that it's in the mix. there can be hundreds of little things that you're going to be going back and going, well, did all that work I did up to this point in the mixing, is that complementing the mix, or is it detrimental and not working well in the mix, and maybe I should have done it a little bit differently? You might even sometimes go back to some of the original tracks, or some of the tracks that you saved after you edited some of them before you processed them, or some of them, like that that you can rework them because of how you're hearing it sit in the mix, that you might want to do things a little bit differently so that it complements the mix better. Because there's been times, an out front vocal, and it's even worse sometimes on support tracks and backing tracks, but even on out front vocal, I get done with it and I'm like, I really wish I would have processed that, a little bit differently, or I would have edited that a little bit differently. Or the flow processing, I wish I'd have put a little bit of delay or lag on that a little bit, or let that hang a little bit longer, or cut that short a little bit there in editing, so because it sounds like it's, all of a sudden the guitar and the bass went da-da-da, and the vocal is dragging into it, and I got to go back and re-edit it, because now that sounds like that would be much better, and it would really complement the mix, and, really work to make that mix sound as good as possible unto itself. Because the out front track sounded awesome by itself, but when I brought it in the mix, that it didn't work out as well as I thought, now that everything else is playing with it. It's really hard to teach that, because it can be very different in each individual mix, and it can be a personal preference. All these things that are happening, like the way I try to teach you all this stuff, is so that I'm not trying to give you my preference on anything. Sometimes I will a little bit, but I try to steer clear of that and say, well, these are options, because you will make your own decision on, if that sounds good. If it just comes out sounding bad, you're obviously got some kind of issue, and you need to ask somebody that's a little more experienced and say, well, this is what Doc taught me, but for some reason it's not having this effect. Why aren't I getting this effect? Does that make sense? Because you're not exactly sure why it's not happening. Whereas someone more experienced that might agree with you or not agree with you might be able to help you get a certain, effect from your song. Because it can be very pertinent that in some genres or something like that, well, sometimes they'll do certain things certain ways to get that effect that you're not catching, because you haven't, produced, 1,500 reggae songs or 5,000 reggae songs. So you're kind of in the dark there, and doing things that, you aren't experienced or understand how they are doing it. So as you understand all these things, that sometimes it's really important for you to go back and say, well, how are these guys doing it? And then how can I apply these other things to it? Once I can get a good mix done, that sometimes you might change things up a little bit to be, somewhat, complimentary, or somewhat sounding like what is acceptable at this moment, producing reggae or something like that, which doesn't mean that's right or wrong. That just means that's the way they're doing it right now, which may change next year. And that's just a fact of, things changing, and things happen, and things, move along into different types of ideologies about how things are supposed to be done at this point in the music industry. So that's just a given. So as you get into this mixing, that those things are going to be very important for you to really keep in mind, so you don't get frustrated. The better you get and the more experience you get, the less of that you'll have to do. And sometimes most definitely your stuff, when you go back to change things, will be much better targeted. So you're not fumbling around going, well, why is that happening? Because from experience, you'll understand, no, I don't need to fuss with the kick drum and doing all that stuff. I want it to thump. I want to do this in this production. And I did all that in processing. I don't need to side process the side chain compression and New York compression thing or do something. I process those drums exactly how I thought I want them. And then you get them in the production, you go, nope, they still sound a little bit flat or something like that. So you go back to those original tracks and process them and edit them, to where they're getting more thump, or the way you want them to sound, and then drive those, events and those tracks into your mix. So you're not fussing with a lot of, mixing techniques. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. Some people do it a little bit differently. By this time, I don't have to fuss with a whole lot because I don't mess with a lot of that stuff because I know basically how I want my kick drum to sound. And if I was wrong and I drag it into the mix and I go, no, I want it a little bit softer or a little bit harder or whatever, then I can either fix it then or go back to the original tracks and reprocess them, until I get them the way that they sound good complementing the mix. And it can be frustrating if you just don't take that into consideration and understand that probably going to be happening. And that's great because as you start mixing things together in the mix, that all of a sudden you start to learn, you start mixing all those things into the mix, and then it sounds different because now that basically the mix is one sound, and it's like it's a combination of all these different instruments and stuff like that, but basically they preserving their identity, but they're also blending to some point, which is going to affect each and every one of them to how they're working together, which can cause you to go back and change how you did a lot of things that you thought it sounded great by itself, but now in the mix it just doesn't. And you'll start to get better at seeing that and then taking that into consideration more and more and more as you work through a production from beginning to end. But it never changes. Every time you start trying to mix things together, that happens. And if you take that in consideration and you think about it and take steps to work with that and change things when they need to be or when you think they need to be, your production will come out that much better instead of getting frustrated about pushing a bunch of faders up and down and going, well, it just doesn't never sound great, bro. What's wrong? I did all that stuff and then it's not working. Because you might have to go back and change things so that they work well together. So that's a huge concept. So really keep those things in mind as we get into the mixing. And another thing is that as we mix, some of the most pertinent things are going to be, as you get into the mixing, your automation. Really get to know your automation tools well, how to use them well, what they do to make things happen. Just get a really good understanding of how your automation tools work on your individual tracks, on your subgroup mix buses, and on your buses. Because when we get into processing, that won't be happening a lot of there, but on those subgroup mix buses and those individual tracks, the bus that's coming off them, because you're going to want to send a bus off each one of those individual tracks for you to use for mixing, that the automation from those buses is going to be very important, and sometimes from the tracks themselves to get things where they want to be. And I do really suggest I use a leveling bus, so that let's say that I've got individual tracks that I've done automation work on that are going to their bus that I might have done some automation work on, or I've got individual tracks in a subgroup that I've done different automation on them that are going to a subgroup bus that I'm going to do automation from there for mixing it into the mix. And that's all going to a leveling bus. That way, let's say this is the whole production from beginning to end. That way, once I get the production done, and I haven't done the automation on the whole production, this is an individual track, but pretending it's, the whole production, then I'm sending that to a leveling bus. So that way that I can adjust any dynamics happening on each section. So each section's dynamics are happening the way I want them. In the very intro, I might want to turn up a little bit. The first, verse, I might want to turn down a little bit. The chorus, I might want to turn up a little bit. The lead, I might want to turn up a lot. That it's going to there next. So all those subgroup buses and those individual track buses routing to a leveling bus to fine-tune the dynamics of the whole production. Once I've done a pretty good job with all my mixing from the individual subgroup buses and from the individual track buses. So, I really recommend you get used to doing that. So that's the first video in our mixing phase, and I will see you in the next video.